frontiersman, aristocrat, lawyer, politician. Some have said scoundrel. Old Hickory, military hero of New Orleans. The People's Choice, 7th President of the United States. The personification of an era in American history that sparks debate among historians even today. Most historians agree that the presidency of Andrew Jackson from 1829 to 1837 marked a distinct period of our nation's history. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, once friends, opponents, and friends once again, died on the same date, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The age of the Founding Fathers embodied in the presidencies of George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe had drawn to a close. The years of President Monroe's administration, 1817 to 1825, called the Era of Good Feelings, were marked by a strong desire for independence and for national unity. Congress adopted the so-called American system. This system was designed to make the United States economically independent and self-sufficient. It consisted of high tariffs or import taxes for the protection of American industry, a national bank to provide a sound financial system, and a national transportation system to connect the East and the West. And Americans from all walks of life worked at the task of making their nation strong. Beneath the surface, however, divisive forces were at work. The new nation was soon split by the growing rivalry among the three major sections: the Northeast with its increasing industrial development and immigrant population, the South, where cotton was becoming king in an economic system based on large plantations worked by slaves, and the West, an expanding area which attracted settlers who established small, family-sized farms and produced abundant harvests. And there was another development. As Americans built their nation, they were also strengthening the spirit and practices of democracy. By 1824, 6 new states, Indiana, Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri, had entered the Union with constitutions providing universal white male suffrage, or a close approximation. And 5 of the older states, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland, had dropped property and religious qualifications for voters substantially. The growing political power of the rank and file of people, as well as the rivalry between major sections of the country, was clearly revealed in the political disputes of 1824 that ended the era of good feelings. In 1824, Secretary of Treasury William H. Crawford of Georgia was one of 4 candidates for the presidency. Each candidate represented his section of the country, and each called himself a Republican. Crawford, however, was the only candidate nominated by what was called King Caucus, the system of choosing presidential candidates by congressional party caucuses, or meetings. John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State, and the son of John Adams, the second president, represented the northeastern states. Adams and the other candidates received nominations from state legislatures and endorsements from irregular mass meetings throughout the country. Challenging the 2 cabinet members was Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, who thought of himself as a national leader, although he was nominated from Kentucky, then a western state. Another contender from the West was General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee, a popular military hero known as a man of action. Jackson supported the growing participation of ordinary people in government, especially in the selection of their president, and he campaigned against King Caucus. The election resulted in what was called a foot race for the presidency, as depicted in this cartoon. The people in general voted along sectional lines. More farmers, workers, Westerners, the new electorate, supported Jackson. When the electoral votes were counted, Jackson led with 99 votes. Adams had 84, Crawford 41, and Clay only 37. No one candidate had the electoral majority needed to win. In such a situation, according to the 12th Amendment to the Constitution, the House of Representatives was required to choose the president from the top 3 candidates. Since Clay was automatically eliminated, he persuaded his followers in the House to vote for Adams, who became the 6th President of the United States. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina became Vice President. When President Adams appointed Clay to the position of Secretary of State, Jackson and his followers called the appointment a corrupt bargain. They claimed, falsely, that Clay had promised to support Adams in exchange for the top post in the cabinet. Jackson was especially incensed because, as he pointed out, the electors had given him the largest number of votes. And that winter of 1824-1825, the Republican Party divided over the bitterness aroused by the election. The Adams-Clay wing became known as the National Republicans, later called Whigs. This party derived its strength chiefly from the well-established propertied classes, bankers, merchants, manufacturers, and large landowners. The opposition party, led by Jackson and New York Senator Martin Van Buren, consisted mainly of small farmers, newly emerging businessmen, and city workers. They were called Democrats, a radical term in those days. A new era in politics was underway. How is it to be characterized? Most historians agree that Andrew Jackson personified the era. He was a man of great charisma, what Ralph Waldo Emerson called a representative man. But what, or even whom, he represented has been a matter of vigorous debate among historians. The wind of democracy blew so strongly from the West, according to historian Frederick Jackson Turner, writing at the turn of the century, it liberalized the aristocratic and stodgy East. Of this frontier democracy, which now took possession of the nation, Turner wrote, Andrew Jackson was the very personification. Jackson was described by Turner in terms that evoke popular frontier heroes, Daniel Boone with his long rifle, and Davy Crockett in his coonskin cap. Turner called Jackson the typical man of the freedom-loving frontiersmen of the West. Albert Gallatin, who had served as Secretary of the Treasury under Jefferson and Madison, described Jackson as he first appeared in Congress as a member from Tennessee, a tall, lank, uncouth-looking personage, his manners those of a rough backwoodsman. Jackson was described in the 20th century by historian Richard Hofstadter, however, as a mid-Tennessee nabob, typical not of the Southwest's coonskin Democrats, but of its peculiar blend of pioneer and aristocrat. Historian Thomas B. Abernathy also called Jackson a frontier aristocrat, and he argued that Jackson had opposed the Democratic trend in his state. Was Jackson a freedom-loving frontiersman, aristocrat, uncouth roughneck? Andrew Jackson was born in a log cabin in the Waxhaw settlement of the Carolina wilderness on March 15, 1767, shortly after the death of his father. During the American Revolution, Jackson enlisted in the militia at age 13 and was captured by the British when he was 14. When he refused a British officer's order to clean his boots, the officer slashed Jackson with a saber, cutting his arm to the bone. The Revolution left Jackson with a profound and passionate patriotism. He lost his family in the war when one brother was killed, another died of smallpox in prison, and his mother died while nursing captured American militiamen. Not long after his mother's death, Jackson traveled to what is now Salisbury, North Carolina, where he studied law and developed a taste for gambling, horse racing, and card playing, very much in the manner of the seaboard gentry of the day. At age 20, he was admitted to the North Carolina bar, and in 1788, he was appointed prosecuting attorney for the Western District of North Carolina, later the state of Tennessee. There he married Rachel Robards, who believed incorrectly that she had secured a legal divorce from her first husband. Although the ceremony was repeated, Jackson's enemies later made capital of the circumstance. Jackson acquired an estate named the Hermitage near Nashville, along with slaves, as he grew prosperous in his law practice and land speculation. He was also active in politics and served as a member of the state constitutional convention, as Tennessee's first congressman, then as senator. In public office, he was inclined to be conservative, Although Jackson had position and influence, he had a hot temper and readily engaged in brawls. When a man named Charles Dickinson publicly alluded twice to Rachel's matrimonial record, Jackson killed him in a duel. Jackson carried from the encounter a bullet close to his heart. But Jackson won his greatest fame as a soldier in the field of battle, where he was called Old Hickory, when a soldier remarked that he was tough as hickory. In the War of 1812, Jackson defeated the Creek Indians at the Horseshoe Bend of the Tallapoosa in what is now Alabama. Jackson's victory over the British in New Orleans, his crowning military triumph, made Jackson a national hero. Because of the slowness of communication, the battle was actually fought after the Treaty of Peace had been signed at Ghent. An irony of history, perhaps, but it did not diminish the importance nor the brilliance of Jackson's achievement. In 1818, Jackson was sent to punish the Seminoles, who were raiding settlements near the Florida border. Without authorization, he crossed the boundary line, captured Pensacola, and executed 2 British subjects, involving the United States in serious trouble with both Spain and Great Britain. Despite misgivings of Washington officials, Old Hickory's popularity soared. In 1821, Jackson was appointed governor of Florida. When he returned to Nashville, a steady stream of prominent men and politicians called on him. They wanted Jackson to be President of the United States. He was now on the threshold of his greatest career. Jackson clearly, as Frederick Jackson Turner remarked, was a self-made man. He possessed the ruthless energy of a frontiersman. Yet he was, by many accounts, patient and gracious with the common citizen, often gentle and grave in manner. Daniel Webster, the famous statesman and orator, said in 1824, "General Jackson's manners are more presidential than those of any of the candidates." Certainly Jackson was a politician, though the character of his politics has been much disputed. Jackson began his campaign for the 1828 election immediately after John Quincy Adams was named president in 1824. And what a campaign it was! The savagery of the 1828 presidential race has rarely been equaled in the history of presidential campaigns. Jackson was charged with being a murderer, a slave trader, a gambler, brawler, and an adulterer. Rachel Jackson, a gentlewoman, dreaded going to the White House. "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of God than to live in that palace," she said. The brutality of the attack, her marriage termed adulterous, she, a strumpet, took its toll. Rachel died soon after the election, before Jackson took office. The Jacksonians were no slouches at political name-calling either. They called Adams, one of the nation's most dedicated and brilliant public servants, a monarchist who fed on the public treasury, the author of a scurrilous poem. Behind the ballyhoo of the campaign, however, were real issues, reflecting the rise of sectional interests. The Northeast strongly favored a protective tariff to protect its burgeoning manufacturing concerns, and supported the Second Bank of the United States. But the Northeast was generally opposed to a liberal land policy in the West. Easterners feared the loss of factory workers to the West, and the loss of influence in the federal government to the West. The South depended on a world market for the sale of its agricultural commodities and opposed protective tariffs, which meant higher prices for manufactured goods imported from abroad. The South also opposed the bank, but was divided on the issue of cheap land in the West. The West, of course, strongly favored a liberal land policy, and it favored internal improvements such as roads and canals at federal expense. The West generally supported the North on the issue of a protective tariff, and the South on the bank issue. Jackson won a sweeping victory, receiving 178 electoral votes to 83 for Adams. Jackson's victory has been called a sectional victory, for he lost New England, but overwhelmingly carried the South and West. The crucial states of New York and Pennsylvania swung behind Jackson, in part because of the new voters, working men and immigrants, and in part because the Jacksonians assured the Pennsylvanians that they favored protection of the state's iron interests. In New York, Martin Van Buren, a Jacksonian, had fashioned a near unbeatable political machine. In the West, Old Hickory had been acclaimed as a frontier military hero, a symbol of the common man. Frontiersmen felt he would understand their problems. Great numbers of small farmers everywhere voted for him for the same reason. Many Southern planters voted for Jackson because he was a landowner and owned slaves himself. Many small businessmen supported Jackson because he was a self-made man, and they believed he would help them to keep the doors of opportunity open. And Jackson's victory was considered a victory of the common man over the aristocracy of money, factory, and land. When the president-elect set out for Washington, the people came out to see him along the route, but they were quiet, respecting his grief over the death of his beloved Rachel. The tall, stooped figure of Jackson dominated the oath-taking with extraordinary dignity, according to accounts of the time. The crowd fell silent as he took his place in the east portico of the Capitol alongside Chief Justice John Marshall. Jackson took the oath of office, then bowed to the people. In a flash, all hats came off, and shouting rent the air and seemed to shake the very ground. The rowdiness of the Jackson Inaugural is legendary. Thousands of Americans from all regions of the country, farmers, laborers, and other ordinary people, poured into the White House, where at a public reception open to all, the boisterous crowd trampled on the furniture in muddy boots, smashed china and glassware, knocked waiters off their feet. This is one of the few photographs of Andrew Jackson, taken late in life. To the factions he defeated, Old Hickory was a radical, yet in his previous political offices, he had tended to be conservative. "I have an opinion of my own," Jackson wrote in 1821, "and when that opinion is formed, I pursue it publicly, regardless of who goes with me." At the time, no one knew what sort of president Andrew Jackson would be. "My opinion," wrote Daniel Webster, "is that when he comes, he will bring a breeze with him. Which way it will blow, I cannot tell." The breeze blew across the nation, carrying with it the democratic ideas and practices called Jacksonian democracy. And Andrew Jackson became the symbol of this social and ideological movement that continues to be the subject of debate among historians today.